Hi class, so here's our second video on the Gallipoli campaign, this time looking at the AIF training occurring in Cairo. So the Australian Imperial Force, or the AIF, gathered in King George's Sound near Albany in Western Australia, and they formed a convoy for their transport to the war. There were 38 transports and 4 escorting cruisers that left during the night on the 1st of November in 1914. The convoy, which included ships carrying New Zealand soldiers, did not reach Alexandria, Egypt until the 3rd of December 1914. But along the way, the Australian cruiser Sydney left the convoy to engage in combat and eventually destroy the German raider Emden in the Cocos Islands. Here we can see some images of the soldiers marching through Albany over here, and on this side here, lined up ready to board one of the boats. The convoy was originally supposed to go straight to England, where the troops would be trained before being sent to the Western Front. But this didn't happen because the Australians could only be housed in tents, and this would have been during the English winter, which was much too cold. So the British Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, agreed that the troops could go to camp in Cairo in Egypt. The camp was set up at a place called Mena, about 10 miles from the centre of Cairo, just on the outskirts of the city. This image here shows the lines of the Australian 9th and 10th Battalions at Mena Camp, looking towards the pyramids in the background. This particular photograph has been coloured from its original black and white version. Here we have another image of an Australian soldier in the camp at Mena. And this one here in the foreground is playing with a kangaroo, which was the regimental mascot. And interestingly, a lot of the Australian units actually brought kangaroos or other Australian animals with them to Egypt. When they left to go to Gallipoli, they donated them to the Cairo Zoological Gardens. And here we have an image of the ordnance area, or basically the supply depot for the camp. The Australian New Zealand troops undertook training in Cairo, and while they were there, they thought that they were going to Europe, and they thought they were going to be fighting on the Western Front. The training was tough and very intense, but most Australians embraced the challenging lifestyle of a soldier, and it involved training all day long, and in every valley of the Sahara for miles around the pyramids of Giza, there were groups of men training. They were working on how to advance, how to retire or go back to their lines, and they were often being instructed by officers. The training that the Australians received was very similar to that of the British Army, and unfortunately there was very little advice coming from the battlefield about the tactics being used in the new form of modern trench warfare. Here we can see 2 images. One is of a group of officers on their horses in Cairo, and the other is of a group of soldiers working a large gun, which you can see on wheels. Of course, both of these types of technology or ways of fighting would be completely useless, not only in Gallipoli, but also on the Western Front. Now, at first, in order to harden the troops, the officers had the men wear their full kits, including their heavy backpacks, during all training. And what this eventually ended up doing was that it was obviously very hot in the deserts of Cairo, and their backs became drenched with sweat. When the men sat down to have their lunch in the middle of the day, they would be wet from their exertions, and the desert wind often blowing on them actually made a lot of the men sick, and there were some men who died of pneumonia in the camp before they even got to the war as a result of this training method. Leisure time in Cairo, there wasn't a whole lot of time for the men to have leisure or leave because their training was 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. But on the day that they had off, or sometimes in the evenings, men would take tours of the pyramids and the tombs. They would haggle with Egyptian traders for souvenirs in the markets, which they would then send home to their families. And these later on became quite precious keepsakes, especially for those men who did not return from the war. Here you can see a photograph of a whole stack of soldiers, and if you can tell, they're sitting on some really large blocks of stone, and that's actually a section of one of the pyramids of Giza. with a sudden influx of new soldiers and the fact that there was no military police, the Australians got a bit of a reputation for being rowdy and for being larrikins. Here we can see two images. This one here has been coloured from the original black and white, and we can see two local guides. And over here, a whole stack of soldiers, both of whom are posed in front of the Sphinx with the Pyramid of Giza behind them. Now, there was some trouble for the Australian soldiers. At one point, there was 2,500 Anzac soldiers said to have gone on a rampage in the red light district of an area called Wassa, which was in Cairo. And they burnt down brothels and dragged out furniture from houses and things. And this was in response to the fact that that there was a huge outbreak or spreading of venereal disease, or an STI, which people thought had been contracted from local prostitutes. So in the end, what we have is the failure of the Allied fleet to take the Dardanelles, which meant that an invasion force had to be assembled. And so that is how the soldiers of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps ended up not going to the Western Front, but rather becoming part of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force and ending up in Gallipoli.